Well, hopefully you've got 1 Corinthians 8 open in front of you, or at least you were listening very carefully to that reading. And if you're new this morning, just to explain that we've been going through this letter that Paul wrote, which is known as 1 Corinthians. We've been going through it for a while, but we had quite a break over the summer, so we're reconnecting this morning. And for those of you who are new to this, and for those of you who perhaps have forgotten about it, the big challenge of this letter is really summed up by these words in the very first verse of the first chapter, which is that Paul speaks about how he is writing to those who are in Corinth, which was a big city all that time ago in ancient Greece, full of all the pagan ideas and all the lifestyles that go with paganism. The majority of people completely ignorant of Christianity. There has never been a Christian church in Corinth before Paul was writing to these believers. And yet he tells us in the first chapter, in the first verse, he's writing to those in that situation who are also called to be holy, called to be different, called to be followers of Jesus Christ, and called to live in such a way that their lives reflect the reality that they are followers of Jesus. And we've been reminding ourselves that we too face similar challenges. We may not be in ancient Greece 2,000 years ago in Corinth, but we're in the 21st century here in Wales, seeking to live as Christian people amongst the challenges of our day. And we've been seeing that while some of the things Paul has to write about in this letter, as we're going to see today in this chapter, might seem a million miles removed from the everyday things that we have to deal with, but at the same time we've been seeing that there are principles all of the time which are always appropriate to our lives. Now, previously in chapter 7, Paul at the beginning of that chapter says that he wanted to respond to the matters which they wrote to him about. And so we're in a group of chapters now where you've got to imagine these Christians, they're struggling. What does it mean to be a Christian now? I used to be a full-on pagan. All my family are pagans. All my friends are pagans. Everyone in work are pagans. But now I've got to live for Jesus. And they've got questions, and they don't quite know how Christianity now fits with living as a Christian in this environment. And so they write Paul a letter. And there are many things raised in this letter. And in these chapters we're involved in at the moment, he's responding to that letter. Now, in chapter 8, it's very clear that really there are two things which have been raised by this letter. The first is a question. May Christians eat food that has once been offered to idols? That is a matter of Christian freedom. And the second one is, if they may do this, what might be the effect of this on other Christians in the church? And that's the issue of responsibility. Now, I don't know when the last time someone offered you food that had been offered to idols. Probably never, at least knowingly. It's not the sort of thing we experience in this culture. There are parts of the world today where that does happen. And it was very much the normal experience in Corinth 2,000 years ago. But we're going to see today that whilst we may not face this particular issue, Paul is raising a very, very important principle about how we relate to one another, particularly when there are differences of understanding in the life of the church. And that is something which is always relevant and always pertinent. Let's look at the question first of all, because it is a little bit foreign to our ears. So he says in verse 1, now about food sacrificed to idols. And the issue is this: can you eat this stuff now that you've become a follower of Jesus? This is actually something that Paul is going to further develop in chapter 10. But really, at the moment, he's looking at whether or not we as Christians have the right to do this. And interestingly, that issue of rights is going to run right the way through this chapter and on into chapter 9 and touch on chapter 10 as well. Now, the words we have food sacrificed to idols actually really was one word in the Greek. It was a word that basically translates as idol food. And commonly people think about this in terms of meat. And the practice used to be that if you were caught up in pagan practices, that you had a piece of meat, well, a third went to the priest, a third got burnt in some sort of sacrificial offering, and a third you could take home or you could consume there and then. So it was a very common practice. In fact, in the culture in which they lived, meat was very, very rare. And so when meat was available, you could guarantee that it had been already involved in this area of being sacrificed to idols. But we need to realize that the words which Paul is using here is telling us that this doesn't just apply to meat. It's actually all food. And in that culture, it wasn't just meat that was offered to idols, but all types of food. Now, I don't know if you remember, but back in chapter 7, when Paul faced questions which were really big ethical dilemmas, he refers to something called the present crisis. They were going through tough times in the church. Not just the church, but in all of Corinth, and in fact we think historically, not just in Corinth, but in the whole of that part of Greece. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that what he's speaking about when he refers to the present crisis was actually a famine. So this issue of food offers to idols is actually coming with a renewed force. It isn't some special food that you would have to go to a special place to purchase so that you could consume it. No, by and large, pretty well all food that you saw would have come through this method. In fact, it would take a great deal of work to find food that wasn't offered to idols. Now, what is clear in the passage is that for some Christians in Corinth, this was a real problem. But what's really interesting is that the passage also is showing us that for other Christians in Corinth, this really wasn't a problem at all. And Paul refers to those for whom it was a problem as describing them as the weak. And that word weak appears 5 times in this chapter. So he's quite clear that those who have a problem with eating food, which has been first offered to idols, he refers to them as being the weak. Now, what is really interesting here is if I asked you this morning, what's the opposite of weak? Well, the very youngest child here this morning would tell you straight away that the opposite to weak is strong. But Paul doesn't then talk about the strong. In fact, he's reluctant really to give the other group of people, that is people who don't see eating meat offered to idols or food offered to idols as a problem. He's keen really not to give them a category at all. But if he's really pushed, there's one point where he describes them, he implies anyway, that they are the free. So there are these 2 groups, the weak and the free. And I think the reason Paul doesn't say the weak and the strong is that he's very anxious not to further polarize what was probably already quite an issue in the church at Corinth. So why was this not a problem for some? Well, it's clear from the passage that they understood 2 things about idols. The first is there in verse 4, that an idol is nothing at all. And the second thing is there in verse 8, that food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. And so the people who had come into this understanding were basically adopting a position where they said all this talk of idols amongst the pagans, we know they're very passionate about it and they get very worked up about it. But the truth is there is only one true living God. And if someone wants to worship an idol, what are they doing? Well, they're just worshipping a vain thing. Verse 4, we know that an idol is nothing at all. And so they came to this position where when it regarded food, they felt free. This isn't a problem. We know the truth. This doesn't trouble us. In some ways, it may be linked with 2 phrases, which if you think back, if you've got really good memory, you might remember from chapter 6, which were slogans in Corinth, and some Christians were actually applying them to their Christian life. Everything is permissible for me. Or another one was food for the stomach and stomach for the food. So there was this kind of sense amongst one group of Christians anyway in the church But this business of food offers to idols was just no big deal. They were completely free. They shouldn't be troubled by it. And it was because of their knowledge and their understanding of what idols were. Now, if we think about idols, actually chapter 8 has a lot to say. Verses 4 to 6, there are a lot of things said there about idols. And the words, we know, verse 4, we know that an idol is nothing at all. Those words, we know, takes us right back, if you like, to everything that the Bible has to say about idols. I mentioned to you, I think last week, in passing, about a moment in the book of the prophet Isaiah, where Isaiah is living at a time when God's people have actually turned their back on him and they're starting to go after false gods, after idols. And so God enables Isaiah to challenge this, and he challenges it almost with humor, certainly with irony. So let me read a section from Isaiah where he's really kind of letting the air out of the whole issue of what idolatry is. He says, a carpenter, this is Isaiah 44, a carpenter measures with a line and makes an outline with a marker. So he draws up plans. He roughs it out with chisels and marks it with compasses. He shapes it in the form of a man. So he's got his plan ready to make an idol. He then says he cuts down cedars, or perhaps a cypress or an oak, so a mighty tree. Some of it he takes and warms himself. He kindles a fire. He bakes bread. He also fashions a god and worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. Half of the wood he burns in a fire, over which he prepares his meal. He roasts his meat and eats his fill. He warms himself and said, I'm warm, I see the fire. And then from the rest, he makes a god. He bows down to it. He prays to it. And he says, save me. You are my God. Now, I hope you can pick the irony up there. That half the wood he burns to make a meal and have a nice evening, and the other half he bows down and says, you're my God. And Isaiah goes on to say, these people know nothing. They understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over so they cannot see. Their minds are closed so they cannot understand. Repeatedly through the Bible, the issue of idolatry is exposed by God to be futile. Now, the question we have to ask today in connection with this, because it's very easy for us to look at this and say, well, you know, we're a more sophisticated Western culture. We don't have idols on street corners. We don't have people gathering in woods to bow down to things. There may be some, there's really few of them, but it wouldn't be a normal part of work. And it's very, very easy for us to associate idol worship with perhaps less developed cultures, or so-called less developed cultures. But an idol is actually anything in your life that takes the place that God should rightly have. We looked a few weeks ago at the priority of worship. And we saw when we looked at worship that the great thing we're called to ultimately is the announcement that Jesus Christ is Lord. But so easily in our culture, it is my career is my Lord. My health is my Lord. My leisure interests are my Lord. My team is my Lord. My family is my Lord. My possessions, my experiences, my holidays, whatever it may be, my wealth is Lord. You see, idolatry is not an ancient problem, neither is it an underdeveloped country problem. It is very much a problem internationally today. And it is a challenge in your life, and it's a challenge in my life. And so we need to hear the voice of Scripture on this. Now, in our passage, we get these words in verses 4 and 5. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. The point Paul is making there, in a pagan culture where there were loads of pagan gods. If you go back to Paul's visit to the city of Athens, it's described in the Greek when he arrived at Athens, he saw a forest of idols. There were so many, it was like a forest of trees. There were idols everywhere. One Roman poet said of Athens, "You are more likely to bump into a god than a man in Athens." There were idols and idol worship all over the place. But in verse 4, Paul makes the statement that every Christian knows to be true, that an idol is nothing. Why? For there is no God but one, the only true and living God. And this leads us in verse 6 for Paul to make a statement which we think was probably an early creedal statement. Yet for us there is but one God, the Father, through whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. So for one big group in the church, eating food offered to idols was no big deal. They were free to do it because they knew there was only one true living God, and idols do not have the monopoly on food. Jesus Christ ultimately is the one through whom all things came and through whom we live. It is Christ ultimately who has given us this food. The only absolute restriction in this passage is that they are told they must not go into a pagan temple to do this. Verse 10, if anyone with a weak conscience sees you, who have this knowledge, that is, who are free to eat this food, eating in an idol's temple, won't he be emboldened to eat what has been sacrificed to idols? So you must never, ever do that. Now, the overall attitude, it seems, from this group of Christians was, well, because of this knowledge that there's only one true God and idols are nothing, this is now my right. I've got a right to do this. And they're basing their right on what they regard as their knowledge. So what about the other group? The group for whom this is a problem. Now, this group know that in the pagan temples, some very dark and evil things happened and were associated with food offered to idols. They'd become Christians probably out of that life. They'd seen it, they'd experienced it, and it was terrible. Paul doesn't say everything in chapter 8 about this issue of food offers to idols. He's going to say more, particularly in chapter 10. And when we get there in verse 20 of chapter 10, he will tell us there that the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to be participants with demons. And he's referring there to the practice of offering food to idols in pagan temples. Now, Paul is right. We know that an idol is nothing in the world. But contexts can change that. And so it seems some Christians were troubled, deeply troubled, by this connection with what they'd seen and experienced previously in their life. And this connection was dominating their thinking about whether or not they can eat food offered to idols. So in verse 7 we read, some people are so accustomed to idols, the memory is still so fresh, that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to idols, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. So the association for some Christians with paganism and demons is so fresh and strong in their thinking, they feel, I can't go near this at all. And I think we can understand that. I think if I had been converted to become a Christian out of that background, I would have great sensitivities, and I'm sure you would as well. In some ways, this is a good example of this is, for example, imagine a Christian who has come from a background of pretty severe alcohol abuse. Maybe they've come from a home where there's been addiction to alcohol, there's been abusive behavior, they've maybe had a very traumatic upbringing, or maybe themselves have experienced the excesses of alcohol and drunkenness, and it's led them into a life of great despair. But now they've come to know the Lord Jesus. And they're forgiven, and they're new, and they're washed, and they're clean. I can quite understand for someone like that they would not want to go anywhere near alcohol ever again. I have a friend who used to play rugby for Aberavon in the 1970s. He was a centre, he was a very good player. And he played against many of the great Welsh greats of the 70s, of the golden era, as they're sometimes referred to. I once tried talking to him about rugby. He's now a minister. He said, I'm not interested in that. I couldn't get a conversation going with him at all. It used to be his God. It was his idol. He lived for Saturday afternoon, 3:00. But for him, there were so many associations with that, which were associations with ungodly living, that when he became a Christian, he said, I moved well away from that. I don't want to go anywhere near that. So it seems you've got these two groups in Corinth. You've got some who get it, that idols are nothing. There is only one true God. This is actually a contract by the pagans to lead you, as it were, to allegiances with demons. The food itself is no big deal. The other group, because their experience within paganism was so dark, so terrible, they just didn't want to go anywhere near that stuff. Now, what is really interesting in this passage is that both groups think they have knowledge about this. All right? The first group, the group who think that it's okay to eat, certainly have knowledge. They know there's only one true living God, and isn't that wonderful? What a relief. Imagine the relief coming to someone in Corinth 2,000 years ago, where there are loads of pagan temples with all sorts of different demands. And how the heck did you know which one was the right one on the right day at the right time who was going to see you through the day? It was a system based on fear and uncertainty. And then somebody had come along and they talked to you about Jesus Christ and said he is the only true and living Son of God. He's the one who made the heavens and the earth. He's the one. It's one God, Father, Son, and Spirit, but he's come to us in the person of the Son. And you put your faith in Jesus, and what a wonderful thing to know that as a result of that, all of your sins, past, present, future, were forgiven. Your relationship with God was secure. Nothing was ever going to deter or stop God from loving you. Your name is written in his book of life, and there's a place in heaven secure and ready for you that no one can take it away from you. What a relief to be a Christian in Corinth. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Hey, what a relief to be a Christian internationally in the 21st century. Let's face it. It's a wonderful thing, isn't it, to come to know Christ. So they had this knowledge. But those who wouldn't go near this food, they also had knowledge. But it was more to do with knowledge with their life experience of walking into the gloom and the darkness of a pagan temple and hearing those weird incantations and strange things and awful practices and, by and large, terrible, almost industrial immorality and the sense of evil in those places must have been almost overwhelming and profound. They have knowledge as well. And they say, we don't want to go near that stuff. So these two groups exist in the church, and they both feel they have knowledge. Now the issue is this. When there are strong differences of opinion over sensitive matters, you have great potential for division. People can fall out. Things can be said that shouldn't be said and regretted afterwards. And we know already that in Corinth there were divisions. So in the very first chapter of this letter, Paul has had to write, hey, as I'm writing to you, somebody's told me that some of you say I'm of Paul, some of you say I'm of Apollos, some of you say I'm of Peter, and some say that you follow Jesus. Well, what in the world is going on? You're all divided when you should be one. We also know that there were false teachers who'd come into Corinth, and they were trying to split the church, as false teachers always do, and gathering people around them and saying, hey, I've got the inside track to God. I got some extra special information. Listen to me and I can make you special. And they were doing their work of trying to divide. So now on this issue, there is a further possibility for further division. You see, it would be very easy for those in the freedom group to look at the other group and say, oh, you lot, you're weak. Or you're being legalistic. Or something like that. And it would have been very easy for those in the group that wouldn't go near this food to look at the others and say, well, you're just a bunch of liberals. You don't know what you're on about. So the potential for tension and falling out here is huge, and it all comes down to the knowledge. Now, actually, there is a wider point to this issue that Paul really drives home in this. You see, he wants us to know that within this division, those who believe they are free to eat this food can very easily, as he says in verse 9, become a stumbling block to the weak. You can damage someone else's faith as a Christian by the way in which you live. Verse 12, when you sin against your brothers in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. So, yeah, sure, there's nothing wrong in eating food offered to idols, because there's no such thing as idols. But in certain contexts, if you do this, you may wound the conscience of another Christian, and in doing so, you sin against Christ. And in verse 11, he makes this very bold statement. It's a very tragic statement. He speaks about the weak brother for whom Christ died may be destroyed by your knowledge. Now, as I've said, both sides are claiming to have knowledge. And really this passage is about what do we do with that knowledge. We have our rights, but is it always right to exercise our rights? And Paul is asking them to rethink the whole matter. So what's the answer? Well, Paul knows that having knowledge is great. It's really important. But what he shows us at the beginning of this chapter is that having knowledge is never enough in and of itself. Something else is needed. Look at verse 1 and 2. We know that we all possess knowledge. Both sides of the argument have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. The man who thinks, or woman who thinks he knows something, does not yet know as he ought to know. Now, Paul is telling us that what is really needed in this situation, where there's a division over whether you can eat this food or not eat this food, and it was causing real problems, the real issue is this. What is really needed is love and humility. There is actually something more important than knowledge here. And he tells us love builds up. It doesn't destroy. It doesn't harm. It builds up. And there probably wasn't a lot of that going on right then. And he also tells us that the man who thinks he knows something, I've got it all sorted, I know all about idols. Also on the other side, may say, hey, I've got it all sorted, I know all about what goes on in those pagan temples, I was in the thick of it once. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. However much a person knows about the things of God, his knowledge is always limited. When we get to the 13th chapter of this letter, Paul is going to write that right now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. But there is coming a day when we will see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Now we are to value knowledge in the Christian life. Proverbs 4:7, wisdom is supreme, therefore get wisdom. Though it cost you all you have, get understanding. Wisdom and understanding are vital in the Christian life. God has given us a book by his Spirit, which we believe to be inspired by God and is infallible. We're to read it. We're to work at understanding it. We're to apply our minds to it. Jesus once said this in Matthew 13, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you. Knowledge is central, paramount to our understanding of God and the Christian life. In fact, in the 14th chapter of this book, Paul is going to say, brothers, stop thinking like children. In regard to evil, be infants, but in your thinking, grow up, be adults. But his point here in chapter 8 is this: knowledge without love can lead to terribly destructive things. And so that's why he writes in verse 1, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And friends, this is what happens when we detach what we know in the Christian life, our growth in Christian knowledge, from our relationship with God. That's what I think Paul is driving at in verse 3 when he says the man who loves God is known by God. And this is why for you and me, in our growth in knowledge about the Bible, of Christian teaching, of Christian doctrine, these things are terribly important. In understanding, we are to be men, adult men and women. But at the same time as this, we need to be growing in the knowledge of our love of God. In other words, our devotional life is really crucial and important. So the point here is that growing in love is actually more important. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Again, in the 13th chapter, when we get to it, Paul is going to say, hey, if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, so if I know everything that can be known, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. That's quite shocking, isn't it, in our circles? Because in our circles, we put a great deal of emphasis on knowledge and learning. It's so easy to do that at the expense of love. So how did this all come together in the church at Corinth? Well, it comes together in the church at Corinth by saying to the group in the church who felt there was no problem about eating food offered to idols, hey, you're not to live by your rights. You're to live by love of other Christians. And so you need to understand that we're not all at the same stage in the Christian life, and we're developing in knowledge. And you're to respect the opinions and the position of other Christians. Don't look down on them, but work to understand them. Be patient with them. And above all, look to live your life in such a way that you don't harm their Christian experience. And so, as Paul writes here in this 8th chapter, he comes to an amazing conclusion in verse 13. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother into sin, I will never eat meat again. That's not an argument for vegetarianism. It's an argument for love. All right? It's an argument for love. Paul is willing to say this: I may be free to do this before God. It may not be a problem. It may be perfectly permissible. But you need to live your life not just living for yourself and your rights. You're to live your life thinking about the consequences in the lives of others. So maybe we need to think carefully about the words we use with one another. Maybe we need to think carefully about what we talk about with one another. We need to think about what is the impact of how I'm living on another Christian. Theologically, this comes together in the principle of the weaker brother. And in verse 9, Paul has written, be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become something to trip up the weak. Are you tripping up another Christian by the way in which you live and the way in which you talk? Love builds up, and we are called to love one another. And friends, this is part of what it means to live holy in Corinth 2,000 years ago. And it's certainly part today of what it means to live holy in Llanelli today. Consider your life, your lifestyle, the places you go, the things you talk about, the way you live. It is not just about your freedoms, but it's about what is best in terms of the impact of your life and the example of your life on others. And let us consider these things lest we be a stumbling block to each other. Well, we're going to close this service by singing our last hymn. Remember, there's tea and coffee here afterwards, so it's miserable out there. Stay in. Enjoy fellowship and encouragement.